My goodness, my goodness. Can we give Stephon Ferguson another round of applause? Stephon, thank you for taking time. We are so glad to have you here at Colorado Mesa University. I wonder if you might take us back to that day. Those of us who've maybe been to Washington, D.C. in August know that it is hot and humid and downright miserable sometimes. But that day wasn't, right? August of 1963, that day was pleasant. And it went off script, didn't it? But that wasn't the only thing that went off script. Tell us about the portion of Dr. King's speech that was not prepared.
The portion of the speech that was not prepared was actually the last portion, which was the I Have a Dream part. When Martin Luther King Jr. actually got he was flying in from New York the night before. He said he got in about 10 o'clock the evening before. He began working on the outline while he was in New York. And when he landed in Washington, D.C., he said he didn't finish the speech until about midnight. The outline until about midnight. It wasn't until 4 o'clock in the morning, the day of the speech, that he actually finished writing the speech. And when he got up to do the speech, he began to, that wasn't part of the manuscript, the I Have a Dream part. And some say that Mahalia Jackson, who was his favorite singer, who sung at the March on Washington, who also sung at his funeral, she stood up and said, "King, tell him about the dream," because he had done that part many times before. And he went off script and he went into the dream. If you ever look at the video of Martin Luther King Jr., you can see it on YouTube, and the full speech, you will notice that when he gets to the I Have a Dream part, when he says, "I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream," he looks up, and because he knows it from that point, because he's done it before. So it was off script. Yeah.
This work that you do all over the world, you've been doing now for a number of years. Is that right? What is the process that has allowed you to not just memorize his speeches, but to actually know Dr. King, to be able to channel his spirit in this unbelievable way?
Well, to be honest with you, I began with Dr. King. I was a DJ, and I used to mix records, and I used to imitate people. So I used to, I can transform into different type of variable technology. So I transform into different people. And so you give me a person, and I can pretty much know. But I was actually playing around, and my friend heard me, and he said, "Man, you sound like Dr. King. You should really consider not playing with it, just taking it to another level." And I began to study Dr. King. I began to buy his books and the books that he has written, his autobiography, and I started reading and learning about him. And I realized that it was a calling of my life to recreate the words of Dr. King. In fact, it's what made me answer my call to the ministry, because I was running away from preaching. I didn't want to be a minister. And God used that to pull me in. And so I began to really study him. I traveled the venues that he's been to, from Atlanta to Memphis, to Jackson, Mississippi, to Alabama, to Montgomery. I marched the 54 miles that they marched from Selma to Montgomery. I actually camped out at night. I did everything. I tried to put myself in, I wouldn't say the shoes of Dr. King, but to see how that really felt, and studying and learning his work, and just listening to his speeches and his sermons. And I really got really engulfed in his work, and that's what kind of led me to this. My first presentation was in 2003, so it's been about 16 years now that I have been traveling and performing as Dr. King, but more importantly, trying to educate people on his philosophy of love and peace and nonviolence.
So you mentioned several speeches and sermons, and I'm sure that over the years you've probably been drawn to a few of them. Share with us, if you would, maybe some of those speeches or sermons that have had a particular impact on you.
One that I would say that had a very particular impact on me, it was a sermon that Dr. King gave. It was called Why Jesus Called a Man a Fool. And at the end of this sermon, Dr. King is talking about how he got discouraged one day. And he said he had just come from a steering committee. He jumped into bed to get him some sleep, and he had to get prepared to get up early the next morning, and he got a phone call. And the phone call basically said, we're tired of your mess, and if you're not out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out, and we're going to blow up your house. And he said that he had heard these things before, but for some reason that night, it got to him. And he said he got up and went into the kitchen to warm up some coffee, thinking that that would give him a little relief. He said he started going back on his philosophical and theological training in school. He said that wasn't the answer. And he said he bent down over the table, and as he had warmed up some coffee, and he said he prayed a prayer. And he said, I prayed out loud that night. And he asked God, he told God, look, I am here. I'm trying to do what is right, but I must confess that I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me losing my courage, then they'll begin to get weak. And he said at that moment, I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for justice. Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for peace. And lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world. And he said that after that moment, that through the entire movement, he had no fear, because he knew God was with him. And that was extremely inspiring to me, because we deal with so much. As you were saying before, we don't realize sometimes what those people before us have sacrificed in order for us to be where we are today as a community. But it was very difficult, living every day under the threat of death, and then seeing your wife and your daughter. The home was bombed. His daughter and his wife were in the home when it was bombed. Luckily, they were not injured. But so I would say that speech, that sermon meant a lot to me. All of them, but that one in particular, and as well as the letter from the Birmingham jail. Dr. King was in jail in Birmingham in 1963, a few months prior to the March on Washington, and he wrote a letter, and it was a response to 8 white clergymen who said his being in Birmingham was unwise and it was untimely, that he was an outside agitator, and that he was a rebel rouser, and that he needed to go back to Atlanta. And he said he couldn't sit in Atlanta and not be concerned about what was happening in Birmingham, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so he wrote the letter in response, and that letter it's detailed, and he's really breaking it down. And I would encourage you, for those of you who haven't, to read that letter. There's actually a recording that I didn't know he actually sat down and read it. It's the only recording that I have of Dr. King that does not have any audience. It sounds like he just woke up, and you can hear it in his voice, and just read the letter. And it's available at the King Center, but it's about an hour long. And he's talking about the situation there. And he's basically saying, the reason why I'm here is because injustice is here. And not including that fact, I'm the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, so I was invited to be here. So I have organizational ties here, but more importantly, I'm here because injustice is here. That's an excellent piece, because it talks about a lot of things that were going on and the struggles that we were dealing with at that time. So I would say those two in particular were.
We are here in Western Colorado. A lot of people in this room probably lived much of our lives in the West. And so it feels like maybe a world or more away of that Jim Crow South, that segregationist South that were the formative experiences of Dr. King's upbringing. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder maybe if you might help us try and contextualize what that radical nonviolence really meant for him and for those who followed him What were those experiences, and how was it that they were able to channel that in his work?
They were able to channel it because of their faith. And Dr. King was, and I always say, first and foremost, a minister of the gospel. And it was his faith that kept him able to do that. The Jim Crow laws were, they were Jim Crow laws. They were laws that were unjust. And the whole piece was trying to bring justice to an unjust situation. And it was, when you think about laws and you think, because people feel like, well, it's a law, then I have to do it. But as I was talking with the students earlier, there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. And everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal. Everything that the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. But it was the law of the land. And so it was, the Jim Crow laws were there to keep segregation going, to keep people separate, to make sure that, or try to make sure that that blacks were just would not get to a certain level. In my own town in my own state of North Carolina, where I lived before I moved to Georgia, there was a law on the books that just came off probably not even a decade ago. If you were caught if you were caught teaching a black person how to read, it was 39 lashes. If you were caught reading, it was more than that. So not only were you in a position where you were dealing with separation, but you were in a position where you could not move forward because of the laws of the land.
And somehow, despite the violence, despite the just savage bigotry that was thrown his way, he was able to embrace and remain nonviolent. How did he do it?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know how he did it. No, he did it because of his faith and his belief and being able to look beyond. The Bible tells us, and he was, of course, a minister of the gospel, the Bible tells us to love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And the reason why Jesus says that is because he knows that you have to look beyond the person. You have to look beyond the person and see what the person was made, and see that the person was made in the image of God. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places and against principalities. And so King would break it down. In fact, people would ask him all the time. They would say, well, Dr. King, what do you mean love these people? I mean, they're beating on us. They're bombing our houses and our churches. They're kicking our children around. What do you mean love them? And King said, I always have to define the meaning of love in this area. And interestingly enough, he goes to Greek philosophy. In the Greek language, there are three levels of love. There's eros, which is sort of aesthetic love. It's more of a romantic love. And then you have phileo, which is a friendship love. I love you because you love me. We're friends. And then you have what is called agape. Agape is an understanding, a creative, redemptive goodwill to all men. It's an overflowing love that seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it's the love of God operating in the human heart. And so when one rises to love on this level, he loves man not because he likes him, but he loves every man because God loves him and he was made in the image of God. And so he goes on with that. And so he rises to the level of hating the system rather than the individual who is caught up in that system. He loves the person even though he might hate the evil deed the person does.
We were chatting with some of our students before this, and it dawns on me that Dr. King gave the speech, that amazing world-changing speech at the age of 34. His life was snuffed out while he was not yet 40. When you look at a room full of college students on this campus, young leaders, future leaders, what do you think that they can best take away from Dr. King's life? What do we need to know for our college students today?
I think the best thing, the number one thing that we can learn is when we talk about King and we commemorate King, I believe the best way that we commemorate it is to follow in the example that Dr. King gave of love and peace and nonviolence. And I think he would still be pressured putting that into existence today. I think he would still tell the students, number one is to believe in yourself. Believe that you're somebody. Believe that you have the qualities and the ability, regardless of your race, religion, your sexual orientation, your political stance, regardless of where you stand, you are a human being, you're a humankind, and you have a gift, you have abilities within you, and believe in that gift. He said in one instance, if you can't be a highway, just be a trail. He said, even if it calls your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of the heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well. Yeah. So
Stephon, you talk about this, bridging these divides, and we look around our world, we open our newspapers, and it's hard to feel like things are not spinning out of control. Our politics feels divisive, broken, unserious, and it just feels like we need a voice like Dr. King today, now more than ever. And I wonder what advice, if I could ask you the impossible, what advice do you think that Dr. King would give us today in terms of trying to address some of these challenges that we face and that divide us?
I would say that the advice that he would give is to, I think, the leadership and being an example. Sometimes it's hard, and it is so divisive, as we were saying before. You have left, right, you have Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. It seems so divisive. But I think that if a person, you have to stand up. You have to engage in, just like the programs that you're all doing. And many of the programs, I met with some of the students, and they're doing such an excellent job in what they're doing and working to make a difference in their community, in their school, in their churches, and that's what it's going to take. I believe that this generation is going to be the generation that's going to turn the tide and to make a difference. We have failed in doing so. We have failed in educating ourselves. So I would say from that aspect is to educate yourself on the history of our nation and know what transpired. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And then being able to transform that into service. Service was one of the biggest pieces, because the thing about it, as King said, is anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul that's generated by love, and you can be that servant. And we can all be those servants.
You speak a lot, Stephon, about faith, and I'm sure there are those in this room who come from different faith backgrounds. Maybe we have some who don't have a belief system at all. And I wonder today, what is Dr. King's message? How do we take things away from that, regardless of where we come from in our faith tradition?
I think that we look at who we are as a people, as opposed to who we are separately, and we have to look at it from a unified perspective, and take those things that are great and utilize them. That's what made King great, I think, because he took from different people. He took Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent method, civil disobedience. He his dissertation was on Paul Tillich and existentialism. And I mean, he dug into a lot of different people, pulled out the greatest, and he really worked it. But what it's going to take is leaders like you who are setting examples for those to follow, because there's so many people who don't want to do the right thing, I guess you would say. But if you're setting that example, you can win them over. It doesn't matter if you have faith, don't have faith, if you believe in God, Allah, Buddha. I mean, it doesn't matter. One common thing that we have is love. And love transcends all religions, all denominations, all races and religions. So if we can build on that love ethic, when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment, he said, love God with all you have and love your neighbor as yourself. Because he knew that if you practice that love, everything else you would obey all the other commandments, because you wouldn't kill your neighbor, you wouldn't steal from your neighbor, because if you love. So the love piece, I think, transcends all of that, and that's something that we can do in setting an example. Because love not only has the power to root out hate, and is the only thing that can root out hate, but it has the power to win that person over.
You've been doing this for many years now, and I've got to imagine that there have been times where it has not been easy to bear that burden and to try and channel Dr. King's spirit. I wonder if you might share with us some of the more inspiring pieces of the travels that you've had and the audiences with which you've spoken.
God has blessed me to have some incredible experiences over the years. I'd say one of the great experiences was London, England. I was asked by Dr. King's sister-in-law. He had one brother, A.D. King, who passed away 15 months after he was assassinated. His brother was found drowned in the bottom of his backyard swimming pool. His wife is still living. She's 87 years old, Mrs. Naomi King. And she invited me. She was invited by the Queen of England. They had this great big celebration at Minster Abbey. Yeah, and she invited me to come. It was about 5 of us, and we spent about a week in London, England, and I spoke on a few occasions. But just being able to sit down and talk with her about the experiences and her connection with Dr. King and her brother, her husband, who was Dr. King's brother, was just phenomenal. Dr. King's brother, and Dr. King was too, but they were very humorous. They were very funny. You don't see that part of it. You see the civil rights, the ministerial piece, but you don't see the funniness. And she told me a lot of jokes and different stuff that I'm not gonna mention, but it was just, I mean, you think about those things, but then you think about being able to talk to people just on a regular basis that doesn't have anything to do with church, just who you are as a person. That was a marvelous experience. I've been able to travel across the world, and I think the young people and our young people are my greatest inspiration, because I see in them things that are going to change this world. And it's just inspiring. So every time I got a letter, Yolanda King is the firstborn. She's the firstborn child of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. And she was born 2 weeks before the bus boycott. 2 weeks before the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, she was born. She passed away in 2007 at 51 years old of a heart attack. Before she passed away, I never met her, but I sent her a CD of me doing the I Have a Dream speech. I think it was like in the early 2000s. She actually wrote me back, and she wrote me a letter, and she said, thank you for the work that you're doing with my father, and thank you for going into the school system, because there can never be enough opportunities for our young people to be engaged in the work that my father did. And I'll never forget it, because it's so every time I visit
a school or I'm talking with young people, I always remember that, and it's almost like I'm living out something that she asked me to do. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned some of the more humorous elements of getting to know the family, and I understand his older sister's still alive. Is that right?
Yes.
And so, as we think about that, sometimes I guess we lionize these folks who are literally chiseled in marble,
Right.
And put them on these pedestals. But when you think of Dr. King, he was in fact human, and so how do we contextualize sort of the whole nature of him, imperfect human as he may have been, with the greatness and the legacy that he left?
Right. Yes, he was human. And I think the things that sometimes we hear about things that Dr. King did or may have done that was not in line with how we have seen him, because we do put people on a pedestal, and they're actually the king, not just the name, but the king. But Dr. King was quick to note that he wasn't a saint, and he was just a regular human being like you and I, and he had flaws, and he had things, but to me, that brings out his humanity, and it shows that we can all be a king. We can all be a Mother Teresa. We can all be what God has called us to be, because within us we all have that gift that God has given us. So with King, I don't think that it takes away from him when we hear these things, but I think it actually adds to his humanity, and it shows us. It's just like Jesus, for those of you who are Christians or believe in Jesus, it's just like how he came to earth as a man to show us that humanity piece of it, and to show us that, hey, even though I am Jesus, I was human as well.
You, I understand, live on the site where the King Memorial and Ebenezer Baptist and the birth home and the rest of it. Tell us what that must be like, waking up, having your cup of coffee, reading the newspaper, and looking out at that site every morning.
It's incredible. I'm actually writing a book because I see the world almost from my front porch. I don't know how it happened, but I've been fortunate to live on the King Center, so I can, from my porch, see Dr. King's birth home where he was born and see where he's laying to rest from my front porch. And I see all the people that come. They have shotgun homes that are part of the Park Service, and I was just fortunate to get one. They were built in the early 1900s, 1903. So it's just, it's surreal to be in that place. And I know it's because God has placed me there. I wouldn't be there had it not been for him wanting me to be there. So I'm writing a book about some of the experiences, because people from all over the world come, and they really ask questions. They almost ask more questions of our shotgun houses than they do of the birth home, because of the look, and they don't believe anybody lives there. We hear them all the time. Nobody lives there. And we got a big old sign that says resident, private residence, but they think that's from back in the day. So it's just, it's an honor to really be a part of that, and I hope that you purchase my book coming out in February.
Stephon, for those of us that want to take something from this night and continue building on it, what's your advice for this audience, for all of us that want to continue to take what we've heard tonight, this inspiration, and take it with us as we move forward?
For many of you and many of the students, I would say continue to do what you're doing, because you're doing an excellent job. I've seen it on Twitter. I've seen it on when someone posted, and I think the volleyball team. That's the volleyball team. All right. You all posted. But I would say really to continue, and the people I met with, the young students I met, continue to do the work that you're doing. Don't be discouraged by old people who may be trying to tell you something and it's a new day. And I'm not saying that because I'm old. And I would say continue to work and delve into, it's about service. It's about being engaged. It's about educating yourself on what it is that is going on. I was at a venue last week, and they were talking about different things, but I noticed that they skipped over a whole 200-year period of American history, and I had to bring it up because not until we really have a serious conversation and have that dialogue, not monologue, but that dialogue, will we ever be able to be the country that we need to be. We are the United States of America. We are not the divided states of America. So, but it's up to each individual, and we have to take on our own responsibilities. I think the young man was saying earlier how we have our own responsibilities, and sometimes we can get in our own way. So that's what I would say, to educate yourself on what is going on, be engaged, and continue with the work that you're doing to make your communities, your state, this nation a better place to be.
Stephon, you have honored us with your presence. This civic forum work that we're doing at Colorado Mesa University, President Foster talked about the value that this brings to our campus. You have honored us with this time, and we just cannot thank you enough. Would you help me thank Stephon one more time?